Europe's a nasty place. Its history is horrific, and the world wars were just the capstone of what had been a millennia of conflict. And so with the American-led order, the Europeans let themselves believe, let themselves hope that history had finally turned the page, and that they were finally had all that behind them. And in that sort of environment, especially in the post-Cold War version of it where the Germans had reunified, Russia was seen as a country that in the end needed to be incorporated into the European family so that Europe could finally be whole, at peace, and free. It didn't work. And so we're dealing with a lot of shattered dreams in Europe right now, right alongside with the war, because a lot of people's guiding ideology and hopes for the future died on February 22nd when the Russians moved in the tanks. And so one of the reasons I think that the European response has been so vitriolic is that they're not just disappointed here, they feel betrayed, that their whole idea of what could happen isn't going to happen anymore. And in their mind, it's very clear who's at fault. The truth is definitely somewhere in between. And if you're looking for someone to blame, I mean, if that's what you're after here, it's definitely the German Greens, because they decided that coal was better for the environment than nuclear power. They saw it from a nuclear waste point of view rather than a carbon emission point of view. So there are a number of countries in Europe that followed the Greens and started dismantling the nuclear power plants, which meant that they had to use something. And natural gas from Russia was the cheapest of the options available that wasn't coal. Of course, the Germans did coal as well. So yeah, we are looking at a massive unwinding of ESG issues in boardrooms across Europe and a massive unwinding of environmental progress in general. Europe is neither a very sunny nor a very windy place. And so they can build all the turbines they want and they put in all the solar panels they want. But in most parts of Europe, especially the northern part that is wealthy, the only way they've been able to bridge the gap is with Russian natural gas, and now that's gone. So they're going to try to build more solar and wind, and they're going to realize very quickly that that really isn't going to solve the problem in most places. They're going to try to bring in LNG from other parts of the world, but every shuttle tanker of LNG that they take in is one that's not going somewhere else. So somebody has to be left holding the bag. It'll probably be the East Asians. And then they're going to make up the difference with coal, which the Germans have a very big head start on because they already get about a quarter of their fuel from something that's called lignite, which is a soft brown coal that's 20% water. It is actually more carbon intensive and less energy intensive, and generates less energy than wood. But that's what they have. So we're going to see a lot of what we thought of as progress towards green goals just being unwound violently over the course of the next several months, because the alternative is to have no electricity, and that is not a viable option. Well, this is the horrific part. If the energy-induced depression didn't get you down, this will. All right, the last time the Russians interfered with exports from the former Soviet Union, it was 2010. And they had a bad harvest and a drought and a lot of fires in Western Siberia where they grow a fair amount of their wheat. So they blocked exports for a couple of months. That drove global wheat prices up by a factor of 2. Remember, food, especially base commodities like wheat, have inelastic demand. So it doesn't take much of a disruption in supply to make prices go bonkers. In their primary export markets, which are the Middle East, prices tripled. And that triggered the series of coups and revolts and wars that we now come to know as the Syrian Civil War and the Arab Spring. So, small amount disrupted, prices tripled in the Middle East, doubled globally, big deal. We're still feeling the effects of that. Oh, this is going to be so much worse. So Russia is the world's largest wheat exporter, and most of their wheat is exported via Novorossiysk, the port that can't be accessed right now. And Russia, the world's largest wheat exporter, has invaded Ukraine, the world's 5th largest wheat exporter, and they are making a drive for the city of Odessa, which is where the Iranians offload all of their wheat. So we're looking at 2 of the top 5, maybe not vanishing. Well, Ukraine's vanishing from the market. Ukraine's going to be a net importer this year. They can't plant anymore. But a lot of the Russian production is not going to be able to make it to the global market. Only if they can rail it to you can you still get it. So Iran's probably okay. There's going to be a little bit more maybe going to China, and that's everybody. Everyone else who relied upon Russian wheat, you're just out of luck. And if you relied on Ukrainian wheat, it's just gone and it's not coming back this decade. That's all piece 1. That's just piece 1. We had a phosphate and a nitrogen fertilizer shortage globally when this all started. You need natural gas to make nitrogen. The European fertilizer manufacturers have already suspended most of their nitrogen fertilizer production because of what's going on with the Ukraine war, and the cost is already, I believe today we're at $60 per 1,000 cubic feet in Europe for natural gas versus the United States, which is like 4.5. So, I mean, there's no way you can be viable making nitrogen at that prices, and that's without sanctions. And 40% of the world's potash comes from either Russia or Belarus. So we now also have a potash shortage because they can't get that to market. So all three of the primary components that go into all fertilizers are in shortage globally. It takes a minimum of 3 years to build out the physical infrastructure to bring a new phosphate a new phosphate or nitrogen facility online, and probably closer to 10 years to get the mine and the mill situation in place for potash. So this isn't a 1 year issue. This is a multi-year issue. And we're going to have a lot of countries around the world, particularly on the poorer side, that just aren't going to be able to use fertilizer this year, which means their yields will crash. The number one importer of Russian fertilizer is Brazil. That's the world's second largest agricultural exporter. So at a minimum, we're going to see the prices for their output going up stratospherically. This is more than enough to trigger a multi-continent famine that starts probably in the third or fourth quarter of this year and then just doesn't let up for quite some time.
What does that mean? When you say a multi-continent?
Assuming that the only disruption we have to deal with is what's going on in China with phosphate, which is a separate story, and what's going on with potash in the former Soviet Union, and what's going on with nitrogen because of natural gas prices. Let's assume that there are no other factors that play into this. We probably only have enough fertilizer that's going to get out there to support a population of about 6 billion. So that means we're looking at 2 billion people entering chronic malnutrition over the course of the next 18 months, probably. One of the things we're going to see is when people realize that they can't just export widgets or iron ore and then import wheat because there's not enough of it. They're going to have to grow it themselves. Now, luckily, wheat is a weed. It is very easy to cultivate. It grows in a wide variety of climates. And under globalization, where everyone goes after whatever bit they can earn the most money for, wheat has been pushed to the margins. So you can go into a place like Algeria and grow more wheat and rip up some of your orchards, for example. You won't get as much bang for your buck in terms of income, but your people won't starve that way. We're going to see that happen across Africa, across Latin America, across East and Southeast Asia, because they're not going to have much of a choice. So either we have 2 million people in malnutrition, or we have maybe 2 billion people, or we have maybe closer to 1 billion people in malnutrition and the collapse of the global agricultural system that brings us out of season blueberries and avocados, or somewhere in between. We are definitely entering a period where it's going to be a very rough sledding in places like sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, because they are the world's countries that are the world's, they are the parts of the world that is most dependent either on direct food imports or on the imports of the fertilizers that allow them to grow most of the food themselves. I would actually toss China into that bucket as well. They're probably at like an 80% import dependency upon the inputs that allow them to keep the Chinese population alive.